So welcome to our continuing ITI VPAT training. We are on Module 4 for going over the Section 508 VPAT and ACR. So I'm Michelle Van Duzer. I am Senior Accessibility Program Manager at Oracle, and I am going to be co-presenting this module with Sam and Laura, both from HP. So if you guys could introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Laura Renfro, and I am the HP Reporting Program Manager.
Hi, I'm Sam Ogami. I am the Design and Development, HP Design and Development Program Manager for the Office of Aging and Accessibility.
Thank you. Yes, it takes all of us to coordinate and get all of this information out for you guys. So this is a reminder slide on the modules. There's 8 modules in this training course, and we really need you to take the other course or other modules before doing this one, because each section builds on one another, so we don't have to repeat a lot of information. So the goals of this Module 4 is to review the Section 508 criteria, how it applies to what we're doing, and show how they apply to hardware, software, documentation, and support services, and then show which sections of the VPAT will cover that criteria. So what is Section 508? Section 508 is part of the Rehabilitation Act from 1973. It's a procurement rule for federal agencies or anyone receiving federal funds, and it requires electronic and information technology to be accessible. So we must give employees and members of the public access to information in a comparable way to other users. So the U.S. Access Board is responsible for the standard, and it was revised in 2017, updated again in 2018, and it combines Section 508 and Section 255, which is a Telecom Act. So you know, think about the fact that when technology has evolved over time, phones and computers, once upon a time, were very different. They're not. They're, you know, you carry a computer in your pocket now. Thus, 508 standard, as we refer to it, or revised 508, really pulled in a lot of the Section 255 criteria. So if you want to get more detail and have fun reading a really long document, we recommend reviewing the revised Section 508 requirements, and it can be found at the Access Board website. So www.accessboard-gov. Excuse me, let me try that again. www.access-board.gov/ICT. I got the hyphen in the wrong place there. So revised 508. It falls under Section 1194.1 standards for the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And there's actually 7 chapters to this document. Chapter 1 goes over the application and administration, and Chapter 2 goes over scoping requirements. Those Chapters 1 and 2 explicit information for both Section 508 and Section 255. So they differ just a little bit, enough to cause problems, but there are duplicate sections in there. Read closely to figure out which ones apply. When we get to Chapters 3 through 7, there is just one set. They apply across the board to both sides. So Chapter 3 has to do with functional performance criteria. Chapter 4 is hardware. Chapter 5 is software. Chapter 6 is support, documentation, and services, and then Chapter 7 is the reference standards. Now, when we get into the individual criteria, the numbering is a little bit different. So an individual criteria, say in Chapter 3, would be 301, 302. You know, Chapter 4 would be 401, 402, etc. So keep that in mind when you're looking at numbers versus chapters. So the big key is to get started is figure out what your product really is. Because so often, you know, teams will get siloed. They'll go, oh, my product is just software. Well, that's nice, but you're going to have documentation that goes along with it. There might be hardware also from another group. You're going to have support services. You know, when your customer gets stuck, how do they contact you? But then, as Sam noted, you might also have third-party products that you incorporate into your product or ship with your product. When you're writing your ACR, you're responsible for documenting the accessibility of all of those. So if you have third-party products, you need to either do the testing, the accessibility testing, and incorporate those answers into your ACR, Or, at the worst case, make sure that that third party has an ACR that you can point your customers to. But remember, all of this needs to be covered in your ACR. Also keep in mind, even though your ACR doesn't cover things like marketing and your company websites, all of those need to be accessible also. So which criteria apply when? Just like Mary Jo went through in the WCAG training explaining, well, sometimes things apply, sometimes things don't. 508 can also be kind of confusing that way. So there are some criteria that apply all the time. If you have a product, Chapter 6, support documentation and services apply. Don't skip it. Your docs have to be accessible. Your support has to be accessible. If you have hardware, there's some criteria that apply all the time, and Sam's going to go into more detail on that. But the criteria that apply to all hardware are 403, 404, 405, 406, 408, 410, and 411. And I didn't go into all the big long names because Sam's going to do that for us. If you have software, and I always try to tell my coworkers, if you have zeros and ones, you have software. I don't care if it's the product, if it's the documentation, if whatever it is. If you have software, 501 general applies. Then, of course, we have special buckets, as I refer to them, special situations. So if you have non-web software, an authoring tool, multimedia, platform, product that is assistive technology, then you have a little bit different stuff that also applies. So let's go into some more detail on this. So as I said, criteria that apply every time. If you have a hardware, software, product, whatever, web-based products, non-web products, you have documentation, and the documentation needs to be accessible. There's actually 3 criteria that you need to meet here. 602 has to deal with support documentation. 602.2 is accessibility and compatibility features of the product. You have to document how those features work. You can't just assume people will figure them out. So that criteria is asking for the documentation about those features. 602.3, electronic support documentation. This is where it says you have to make sure that your documentation meets the WCAG criteria. Thus, complete the WCAG tables of the ACR to answer this one question. 602.4, alternate formats for non-electronic support documentation. This has to do with the fact that if you give your documentation in just print version, you need to also make it available in electronic format for your customers. Then on the other side, we have 603 support services. There's again 2 requirements here, 603.2, information on accessibility and compatibility features, and 603.3, accommodation of communication needs. So whatever method your customer uses to contact you, that has to be accessible, and you need to be able to support them in that same style. So just a reminder, WCAG applies to more than just web, and in this case, it applies to your documentation, no matter what kind of documentation it is. So I'm going to hand it off at this point to Sam and have him cover some of the hardware stuff.
Thank you, Michelle. So just to level set here, hardware is any tangible device, equipment, or physical component of information communication technology. And examples of this can be things like telephones, computers, multifunction copy machines, and keyboards. So for criteria that apply to all hardware in the categories of closed product, back office, two-way communication, and audio video include 403 biometrics. And this is that biometrics is not used as the only form of user authentication or control. Preservation of information provided for accessibility so that accessibility is preserved throughout the hardware. Accessible information is preserved throughout the hardware. 405 privacy means that the same level of privacy is maintained for all users. Industry standard connections, so 406 standard connections, that they're provided at least one set of industry standard connections. 408 has to do with display screens and making sure that there are appropriate view angles for them, so it's viewable from 40 inches from above the ground. 410 has to do with color coding and making sure that color is not used as the only way of conveying information. And 411 is about audible signals, and that audible sounds aren't used as the only way of conveying information. So criteria, again, that might apply to some hardware in closed product, back office, two-way communication, and audio video are 402 closed functionality. And this has to do with hardware that doesn't allow you to add or plug in or install assistive technology. 407 is operable parts. And just for a reminder, operable parts are anything in hardware that has to do with user controls for activating, deactivating, or adjusting that information communication technology. 409 has requirements that have to do with status indications. 412 is ICT with two-way communications. 413 has to do with closed captioning processing technologies. 414 has to do with audio description processing technologies. And 415 is a requirement about controls for both captions and audio description. So this slide is just a table summary of the two previous slides that I've went over, with X's for things that always apply to the hardware criteria, or sometimes, or that might apply. So in the hardware criteria, there are some exceptions that can be applied. One of these has to do with assistive technology, sometimes called AT. And you can think of this assistive technology as things as specialized switches or screen readers or screen magnification. The other category of exceptions in hardware are devices for personal use. And some examples of this are calculators or some medical devices. Now, when thinking about the personal use exception, caution should be exercised when applying this exception. As products are, how products are used are determined by the consumer or by the purchaser and the end user. So really, again, just caution when using the personal use one exception. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So we'll go on to the software stuff. So criteria that apply to all software. And I want to stress this one because I know I run into this quite a bit, in that 501 general, you must complete the WCAG section no matter what kind of software. So that means even if you have non-web software, any kind of software basically must complete the WCAG criteria. As Mary Jo noted in the last module, the W3C has a document called Applying to Non-Web ICT that contains details about how to apply WCAG in a non-web situation. As she noted, the following criteria do not apply. So 2.4.1 bypass blocks, 2.4.5 multiple ways, 3.2.3 consistent navigation, and 3.2.4 consistent identification. So revised 508 requires that you complete WCAG 2.0 level AA, and if you want to go beyond that and do 2.1, that's fine, but that's optional. But 508 does require WCAG 2.0. So criteria that apply to some software, we talk about, there's these other buckets. So we have the non-web software, we have authoring tools, multimedia, platform software, and the product is assistive technology. So these different buckets have criteria in addition to completing the WCAG section. So let's break those ones down. So non-web software, what I mean by this is like your command line, your native mobile apps, your electronic documentation, non-web software, say a GNOME app or something. All of those you still complete the WCAG criteria, but then you have two additional criteria to fill out. So that's 502.2.2, no disruption of accessibility features, and 502.2, user preferences. When you get to multimedia, again, fill out the WCAG section, but then you have 503.4.1 caption controls and 503.4.2 audio description controls. For authoring tools, this one gets a little bit more complex. So there's 4 requirements here. 504.2.1, preservation of information provided for accessibility in in format conversion. That goes back to if you're converting from one file format to another, all that accessibility information needs to be transferred also. Don't be skipping things out. 504.2.2, PDF export. Again, if you export out to a PDF format, you need to make sure that it meets with PDF, I think it's what, UA-1 as the standard that it meets so that the PDF file is also accessible. 504.3 prompts. If you have an authoring tool that is helping a person create something such as a dashboard or a report, you need to prompt that person to make sure they're doing things the right way. And then 504.4 templates. If your product includes templates, you need to make sure those templates are accessible. As I said, this is all, of course, in addition to the WCAG criteria that you complete. So we have here a flow chart that talks you through the choices on how to determine, is this an authoring tool? And if so, what sections do I complete? I'm not going to go through this because it's quite a complex drawing. And when you have the slides, there's a full alternate text for all of the information that's in this slide. So platform products. What I mean by a platform is something like an operating system, a web browser, plugins for browsers. Again, in addition to WCAG, you have many more criteria to fill out. One thing I want to flag is a lot of companies have something called platform as a service, and that is not what we're talking about here. But again, operating systems, browsers, plugins, things like that. I highly recommend read 508 directly and learn the definitions there. But the additional requirements, we have 502.2, and we put .x here because there's 2 requirements that have to do with interoperability with assistive technologies. And then there's 502.3.x, which is accessibility services, and there's 14 different criteria that you have to address there. And 502.4, platform accessibility features, and 503.2, user preferences. Assistive technology does have a specific requirement also. That's 503.3, alternative user interfaces. And then we, of course, have another bucket of things that apply sometimes. The 302, functional performance criteria. This comes into play when you are unable to evaluate your products using the WCAG criteria. So it was kind of future-proofing for Section 508. But also when you're using equivalent facilitation, you then have to fill out the additional 9 criteria for that. So that's 302.1 without vision, 302.2 with limited vision, 302.3 without perception of color, 302.4 without hearing, 302.5 with limited hearing, 302.6 without speech, 302.7 with limited manipulation, 302.8 with limited reach and strength, and 302.9 with limited language, cognitive, and learning abilities. So what we've done in this slide 22, is just done a table view of the information I just covered. So that way you can get some clarification on when does a section have to be completed. And you'll notice that 501.1 scope is the incorporation of WCAG 2.0 AA and all the different categories, web UI, web docs, non-web UI, command line, native, non-web docs, authoring tools, multimedia, platform, and AT. All have to fill that out. So I know I often hear teams go, oh, it's not web, I don't have to do this. Yes, you do. Read it. You have to do it. So I've got some screenshots here for a portion of the VPAT. This is the applicable standards and guidelines portion at the beginning of the VPAT, where you're telling your VPAT reader what sections of the VPAT you are going to be completing. So in this case, it's showing the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, and it's saying that yes, we're going to report on level A and on double A, and no to AAA, and then it's also listing the 508 standard, and yes, we're reporting on that. So when you get to the entry of the actual criteria in the WCAG table, Mary Jo showed this table before. Gets a little complex when you do the international version, but within the 508 version, we give you a reminder. This shows like for criteria 1.1.1, non-text content, you need to fill it out 4 different times, depending on what your product is. Remember, you started with by figuring out what your product is, and that helps you determine how many times you fill this out. So for 501, there's the web and the non-web software. 504.2 talks about this criteria with regards to your authoring tool, and 602.3 talks to the criteria with regards to the support documentation. So again, you fill out the conformance level. If they're all the same, you can just answer at once, or if you have different levels, you probably want to call them out separately. And then you have your remarks and explanations, remarks about how you've met this criteria or how this criteria does not apply, or if your if your product has bugs in this criteria, you need to explain those bugs in plain English, and if there's any workaround, explain how you would work around that issue, and how does the customer find out more information about that. So maybe a bug ID that they can contact your support people. I've got a second screenshot here that goes into, we also note when you don't have to fill out that criteria for certain situations. So in this case, we have 3.2.3 consistent navigation showing, and it reminds you that it does not apply to non-web software and non-web docs. So you'll notice the last 2 columns with regards to, the support level and remarks and explanations, there's only the entries for web, electronic docs, and authoring tools. So the electronic docs is there assuming that they're web-based docs. So, reminder, I've brought this up multiple times. You need to determine what your product is, and that will then in turn help you figure out which portions of 508 apply, and then in turn what parts of the HCR to fill out. So some criteria apply all the time, Chapter 6, that's the support documentation and service. Some criteria apply to all software, that's your 501 general. Some apply to all hardware, 403 biometrics, 404 preservation of information provided for accessibility, 405 privacy, 406 standard connections, 408 display screens, 410 coloring tools, and 411 audible signals. So the rest is a mix, and it's going to be based on what your product is. So some resources for you. The VPAT files are out on www.itic.org/policy/accessibility/VPAT. And then information on how to meet WCAG 2.1 or 2.0, go to www.w3.org/WAI/WCAG21/quickref, and then you can do this, the /versions equals 2.0 or 2.1, whichever one you want. And then the WCAG to ICT overview. Highly recommend this if you have non-web stuff. That's again at the WCAG site, www.w3.org/WAI/standards-guidelines/non-web-ICT. So if you have questions or feedback on this course, we appreciate it. Send us an email at info@itic.org, or you can contact us via phone at 1-202-737-8888. And a thank you to the contributors for helping pull this material together and presenting it. So it's HP, IBM, Intel, Lexmark, Oracle, and VMware. So Laura, do we have any questions in the chat that have come up or things that I have wrong?
Well, you did nothing wrong. Great job. And I don't have any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you for attending today. We very much appreciate it. And again, send us feedback if you have any input on the course. Thank you.